So that was straight up habitat destruction. We're going to move on to the second type of habitat loss, which is habitat fragmentation. And this has to do with the pattern at which habitat loss occurs. There are some patterns that are more detrimental than others. And so habitat fragmentation is when a large continuous area of habitat is broken up into smaller fragments. So this is an example. So we can see we could keep all of the habitat in one big block like this 87 hectare block, or we could end up with lots and lots of these little like 2 hectare blocks of habitat. And this would be classic habitat fragmentation. So what causes fragmentation? Think about it for just a second. What do you think creates these little tiny patches of habitat all over the place instead of larger blocks of habitat? So deforestation is a big reason. A lot of times when forest is cut down or new farms are created where forest used to be, it happens in little patches. And sometimes this happens because there are multiple different owners doing different things with their land instead of one big concerted effort. So a lot of times it's because one person doesn't make a farm. Lots of people make little farms and they kind of just eat away at the habitat and end up with these little tiny patches left. This shows loss of forest in Southeast Asia from 1970 to 1990, and the dark green is forest. And you can see that most of the forest was pretty continuous in 1970. But by 1990, lots of it was left in these little tiny pockets. There were some large expanses left, but a lot of it is in these kind of little tiny patches. A lot of habitat fragmentation occurs when we build roads. You might not think a road's a very big deal because it's not very wide necessarily, but it breaks the habitat up in little pieces. There are certain changes that can occur as we cut out forest in particular. And there are some wildlife that are scared to cross roads, whether it has traffic or not. Some of them, especially smaller things, are just, they see an open area and they're not comfortable crossing it and they don't. And so that creates little pockets of different populations of wildlife. So this shows an area of Colorado in 1957 and 1994. And it often starts with these unimproved roads. And we often think, oh, a dirt road, that's not a big deal. But it can cause substantial changes in some areas. And so we can see that often unimproved roads also eventually lead and become improved roads. And so we see that that's what's happened here. So most of the roads that were unimproved in 1957 are now improved roads by 1994, and they've created now these large grids, and we end up with these small pockets of habitat. And so that's a big contribution to habitat fragmentation. I said before, roads can be major barriers. For wildlife in particular, we see that we do get traffic mortality. So this is a tapir that's been hit by probably a logging truck. We see some wildlife treat roads as barriers, so they start to cross the road. If there is traffic that comes by, they might get scared and turn around and not ever find a time when there's not traffic to cross that road. Some wildlife avoid edges, and so we see here they might see a canopy opening in the trees and turn around and move away from the road before they even get close to it. They don't like to cross open canopy areas. They need trees over areas where they're going to cross. Other effects can happen. So predation, some predators are attracted to roads, and so other wildlife might be more likely to be preyed upon if they are near a road. We get pollution from roads. There's air pollution, but also vehicles leak various fluids, including gas. Also, in farther north, They will apply things to the road to keep them from freezing over. So things like salt. Some places will add ash to make snow and ice melt more quickly. And then there's a whole zone of disturbance, depending on what different kind of variables we're thinking about, can penetrate into the forest if there is a road. Globally, roads have fragmented land into about 600,000 parcels. Greater than 50% of them are smaller than 1 kilometer squared, and only 7% of them are greater than 100 kilometers squared. And this is from a few years ago. This increases every year. The red areas are roads with a 1 kilometer buffer, and it shows orange through blue are roadless areas that have patch sizes of 0.01 kilometers squared on up. So you can see that there are some areas, especially the eastern and the very western United States, have very high densities of roads. Europe has very high densities of roads, and Japan has very high densities of roads. Most of the other parts of the world have larger patches of land that are roadless, but where we live, we are included in this area that has very few large areas that aren't dissected by roads. We see that roads are expected to increase greater than 60% globally by 2050, and roads often facilitate other types of development. So this is actually an aerial photo of something that happens very close to where we live. So what do you guys think all those weird little patches are in the landscape? They're actually natural gas pads. And so if you get on Google Earth and turn the satellite on, you can see lots of really interesting patterns in the landscape. And so just very close to us, there's enough natural gas development that you will see landscapes that look like this in our area. So, effects of fragmentation. How does this habitat fragmentation alter biotic communities? So, small patches may not be large enough for large predators, so we may have a smaller set of ecosystems, and we may lack the control that predators have on herbivores in these smaller patches. Fragmentation limits dispersal and colonization. I mentioned this with the roads, but if the small patches aren't close together, animals may not be able to move between them. Plants may also be limited. Things that are wind pollinated or have seeds that are wind dispersed may be okay, but other kinds of plants may really be limited if these small patches aren't very close to each other. There may be restricted access to food and mates, so small patches of habitat may not have everything that a wildlife species needs. It might have food, but there might not be enough individuals in that patch to find someone to mate with. There might not be hibernation locations. There may not be enough water. You might need a larger patch to have all the resources that a population needs to be successful. Can also break populations up and create problems that are associated with small populations, and we'll talk a lot about that later on in this course. It may also increase the frequency of interspecies interactions. So again, there might be a higher likelihood of being predated on if you're concentrated into a smaller habitat patch. Finally, you can get edge effects, and I'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. So edge effects are changes that occur at the boundary of two habitats. And a lot of times these examples are effects in forests when the forest is near an edge. So you can imagine here, like this picture, there is this stark edge, and we're looking at changes that are different near the edge of this forest that are different than a patch inside the forest farther in. And so some things can travel pretty far into the forest. So up to 400 meters into an edge. And if you're used to thinking in feet, remember that a meter is about 3 feet. So 400 meters into the forest, you get increased wind disturbance. About 300 meters into the forest, you get elevated tree mortality. 200 meters, you get altered species composition of leaf litter invertebrates that might be important for decomposition and nutrient cycling. And then around 100 meters into the forest, you get changes in the abundance and diversity of leaf litter invertebrates, changes in foliage density, reduced canopy height, faster recruitment of disturbance-adapted trees, and then less than 100 meters in, you get changes in soil moisture, changes in lower canopy foliage density, changes in air temperature, changes in bird abundance, humidity, understory foliage, soil moisture, and changes in fungi. So these are a lot of different documented edge effects that researchers have found, and some of them can go up to 400 meters. So that's 0.4 kilometers. That is a long way into a patch. And if the patches are too small, they might be all edge. So these smaller patches of forest might all have increased wind disturbance in comparison to larger patches of forest. So edge effects result as fragmentation increases. So this shows areas that they're calling edge. So this kind of peach color is the edge. So we're saying that in 100 meters in, there are these edge effects that we see in the forest. And the interior, so in a large patch, this is a kilometer by a kilometer patch, we get 64 hectares of interior if it's all one patch. In this case, they bisected it with a railroad, and then they bisected it the other way with a road. And this led to only 34.8 hectares of interior good habitat. So if you have a species that really depends on this undisturbed interior, just putting a road or a railroad through that might really decrease the amount of habitat available to those species. And so you can see decrease it by almost a half by just putting a small road and railroad through that area.